Hi guys, this is a belated effort to record a series of videos on the second half of our class on regional climate security impacts, starting with the continent of Africa. We first talked about my work on climate security vulnerability hotspots and then turned our attention to the intersection of chronic and emergent sources of climate risk. Then began talking about some specific cases like farmer-herder violence, in the Sahel in West Africa, before finally turning to the chapter in my book on Somalia and Ethiopia. Why did you have famine after drought in Somalia but not neighboring Ethiopia? And we finally ended the class with a discussion of what should the regional policy responses be to avoid dangerous climate security impacts. When we look at the continent of Africa, it's often described as the most vulnerable continent in the most vulnerable states to climate change, in part because it's seen as having especially low adaptive capacity relative to other parts of the world. So there are severe climate impacts from drought and wildfires, and some places are exposed to cyclone risks on the eastern side of the continent in Mozambique and Madagascar in particular. But the reasons for the African continent's particular overall vulnerability are often thought to have to do with low levels of economic development, high dependence on rain-fed agriculture, and weak governance. And so some of the work that I talk about is based on my research that seeks to get at where those factors or factors like these likely can join to identify hotspots of risk. We started off with a discussion of my piece on climate security vulnerability hotspots, which map locations at the subnational level that we thought were likely to have the worst consequences of climate change. And that included the risk of large-scale loss of life from humanitarian emergencies, but also the risk of conflict. And we got at these risks by combining indicators of physical exposure to climate change, population density, household and community resilience, mostly related to education and health, and finally governance. And these four baskets together were consolidated into a single index that would allow us to identify the likely places that would fare worst from climate impacts. The intuition behind the model is that physical exposure alone does not lead to negative security outcomes. It depends on whether people live in a given location, and secondarily, what are the resources that communities and households can bring to bear to protect themselves. We also note, though, that physical exposure to climate risks often exceeds the capacity of local communities to adapt, and therefore governance matters in shaping whether or not communities get the support that they need in the event of exposure to severe climate risks. So in our work, we develop a composite index that's additive, and we experiment with alternative ways of weighting the index. But essentially, there are four baskets, each of which, save for population, is comprised of multiple indicators. So we have a variety of indicators of physical exposure related to historic climate hazards like drought and wildfire, floods, cyclone risks. And then we have an indicator of population, of where people live, and then we bring in another basket of household and community resilience related to education and health. And finally, we bring in governance indicators related to quality of national level governance and at least one indicator of localized violence. We were able to develop maps of physical exposure to climate hazards and the physical exposure map shows that high hazard exposure is concentrated along the eastern coastlines of Madagascar and Mozambique, driven in part by their unique exposure to cyclones and low elevation coastal zones and sea level rise. Other areas of high exposure include Egypt at the mouth of the Nile, coastal and riverine Nigeria, and other edges of West Africa. And then a band of higher exposure also extends across from Somalia to Gabon, a function largely of droughts and wildfires. A map of population concentrations in countries like Nigeria, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the Great Lakes region shows higher population densities in those areas. A map of household and community resilience, which draws on indicators of health, education, access to health services, and daily needs, shows areas with the least resilience across a range of indicators include Somalia, northern Mozambique, a band across the Sahel, and pockets in Sierra Leone, Guinea, and coastal West Africa, and then northern and southern African countries tend to be more resilient. In terms of governance, there are relatively few surprises, with countries like Somalia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, and Zimbabwe among the least well-governed places on the continent, as well as pockets in Sudan and South Sudan. In terms of better governance, a number of the island countries like the Seychelles, Mauritius, Cape Verde fare better, Botswana, and parts of Morocco, Namibia, Ghana, and South Africa were relatively better governed by comparison. The overall patterns, as you see in the map, show Somalia as the most vulnerable, combining all indicators with a band of high vulnerability extending across the Sahel, with southern and northern Africa being the least vulnerable from our multidimensional index perspective. So that paper suggested that there are places of chronic vulnerability that are likely to be at risk of severe climate security impacts, large-scale loss of life, as well as conflict risks. But this is a chronic map based on historic indicators rather than one that assesses emergent risks. And so in a different short thought experiment with Nina von Exkuel in Foreign Affairs, we tried to take a number of indicators of chronic risks of instability and match that with some emergent indicators of water scarcity, and that approach yielded some interesting results. In terms of chronic risk factors, we looked at high dependence on agriculture in terms of employment, historic incidents of violence, and high political exclusion to get at countries that were chronically at risk of having instability and food insecurity. And we drew on the wider literature that we read about for those chronic risk indicators. And that yields a map of a number of countries in the world that are at high risk of instability given those risk factors. This was a global portrait of 20 countries that had two risk factors, both high dependence on agriculture and a recent history of violence. A further 9 of them had a third factor, which is high political exclusion. And so there are countries like Afghanistan, Congo, Ethiopia, Central African Republic, Cameroon, India, Mali, Mozambique, Niger, Rwanda, Somalia that had 2 risk factors, and another set of countries like Angola, Democratic Republic of Congo, Myanmar, Pakistan, Rwanda, South Sudan, Sudan, Uganda, and Yemen that also have high ethnic political exclusion. We also brought in a measure of emergent water scarcity using analysis from the consultancy iSciences, which does periodic drought forecasts at the subnational level. We aggregated these up to the national level to look at countries that had, over the previous 9 to 10 months, experienced severe water deficits, and those that over the next 9 to 10 months that were likely to experience severe water deficits. And there are a couple of different ways we got at that, in terms of a large proportion of the people or a large proportion of the landmass that was facing or expected to face a severe water deficit, either a 10-year or 30-year severe water deficit. And that mapping effort yielded some very interesting results. iScience has projected that several countries would have continued severe water deficits, and an additional set of countries didn't yet have severe water deficits but were likely to. So Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen would continue to have high water deficits, and another set of these countries, Chad, Cameroon, the Central African Republic, Ethiopia, Mali, and Niger, were likely to have high water deficits in the near future. And this work was done in the 2018 period and looking out over the period of early 2019. As we talked about specific issues, one of those is the concern about farmer-herder violence. And that is a problem that we read about previously in our discussion of Laikipia County in Kenya, but the drylands across the continent, particularly in the Sahel, and that band that extends from West Africa over to Somalia, are often thought to have these risks of high farmer-herder violence. Farmer-herder violence has emerged because there are practices of transhumance, of periodic movement of nomadic or semi-nomadic populations of livestock herders who often find it seasonally necessary to move their livestock, and they may come into contact with settled farmers in other regions and can end up, if the process isn't handled correctly, with the livestock eating the crops or competing for water with these settled farmers. And the problem of climate change has accentuated these risks. And so we read about farmer-herder violence in a piece by Leif Broadham. That piece doesn't have as much of a climate change angle to it, but there are other studies that suggest that climate change is causing herders to have to move further afield, to move beyond traditional areas where they had practiced pastoralism, and that puts them at greater risk of coming into contact with farmers that may not be used to having those herders graze upon crop stubble. And climate change also may make rainfall periods and seasonality different, so that herders are having to move at different times of the year. And this upsets the normal balance where farmers and herders had implicit or explicit agreements where the farmers would harvest their crop, and then herders could come in and allow their livestock to graze on the stubble. That may be upset in a world with climate impacts increasing, but there are other drivers of destabilization, in that there may be more settled farmers expanding into traditional pastoralist grazing areas. There may be a preference by states for settled farming over what's perceived to be as a artifact of traditional nomadic lifestyles. There may be ways in which rich politicians are buttressing excessive populations of livestock populations, not to sustain the herders themselves, but for those herders to basically be in the employ of wealthy individuals. There are a host of other risks that may be accentuating the difficulties of managing farmer-herder conflicts peacefully, not least of which is the decline in traditional institutions that could have resolved differences peacefully. Overlaid upon this is something that Leif Brodum talks about, is rising Islamist movements that are preying upon these herder populations to recruit from them to maybe identify individuals who have been dislocated from herding practices and recruit them to join Islamist violent movements. And that's maybe given herders a bad name, and it's difficult for governments to distinguish between legitimate grievances of herders and violent movements from Islamist movements. And he makes a number of recommendations to try to disentangle those groups, to enhance efforts to resolve differences peacefully, supporting local conflict resolution mechanisms, and other ways to recognize the legitimate rights and aspirations of nomadic peoples. Another risk that Brodum talks about is how herders have been marginalized and have been also forced into movements into national parks, and they're subject to because these areas are perhaps less supervised and overseen by national authorities, that there are more depredations by criminal elements in these Islamist movements, and that may also put pressure on the parks for resources, but lead to violence or efforts by these elements to conceal themselves in these national park areas as a means of projecting power from the parks into the wider country context. A second specific set of cases we talked about compared Somalia and Ethiopia and are drawn from my book, States in Nature. Why did Somalia have a famine after drought but not neighboring Ethiopia? In my chapter, I document how in 2010-2011, Somalia had on the order of 260,000 deaths, excess deaths from drought, whereas neighboring Ethiopia in 2015 experienced a severe drought and hardly anyone died. What explains those differences? And can we also trace differences in Ethiopia compared to itself? So if you're familiar with Ethiopia in the 1980s, it experienced a severe drought that led to a famine that killed on the order of 300 to 500,000 people. It was made famous by a series of concerts organized by the Irish musician Bob Geldof, the Live Aid concerts, which sought to raise funds and attention for that unfolding famine. That ultimately, that famine still claimed many hundreds of thousands of people's lives and was bound up with wider political violence in Ethiopia. But flash forward to the 2010s, and by then Ethiopia had a drought, but hardly anyone died. So what accounts for those differences? Again, the argument in my book is that state capacity, political exclusion, and access to foreign assistance largely explain those differences. And I go through that chapter to show how both faced severe drought risks that could have killed lots of people, but only one of them experienced a famine. And in Somalia's case, it's the function of a weak state with relatively high levels of political exclusion and blocked foreign assistance that explain why Somalia fared so much worse. And in Ethiopia's case, I show that the state had better state capacity, if not high levels of state capacity, and that state capacity had improved over time, and it had reasonably inclusive governance, even though it was not a democratic regime, and was able to build its state capacity and respond to the drought in 2015 by making good use of foreign assistance. So the chapter does a variety of things. It first shows the physical hazards and how both countries face severe drought risk, although not quite at the same time. I then chart differences in state capacity, both in the sort of general level with data sets of government effectiveness and bureaucratic quality, and then show specific differences in levels of drought preparedness and state capacity that's relevant for the particular hazard the countries faced. And then I show differences in political inclusion and improvements that Ethiopia had made over time to become more inclusive, and that how, even though it was not a democratic state, it was often described as an inclusive authoritarian with a subsistence social contract to prevent wide-scale suffering from exposure to drought. Whereas in Somalia's case, there were still a reasonably high number of minority clans that were excluded from access to services. Finally, in terms of the two countries and their access to foreign assistance, I noted that both al-Shabaab, the Islamist militia that controlled part of the country at the time, and the United States blocked foreign assistance, in that al-Shabaab did not want to have foreign assistance to come in unless they controlled it, and the US did not want to allow foreign assistance into Somalia in the lead up to the famine because it was worried that al-Shabaab would divert it to support their own ends. And as a result, you had high numbers of people die, and that the aid that wasn't allowed into the country until it was too late. Whereas in Ethiopia's case, through their productive social safety net program, you had food for work schemes, you had food aid pre-positioned in other ways to prevent the drought risk manifesting in terms of food insecurity and high levels, and people were able to survive that crisis moment, and the aid was relatively well distributed, and that those programs were supported by international assistance and put to good use, and Ethiopia during this period was an aid darling. The last thing that I do, though, in this chapter is discuss alternative explanations, like the high levels of violence in Somalia that could have prevented delivery of foreign assistance. But I make the argument that this was a surmountable problem, that once the international community decided that these previous restrictions imposed by the United States on foreign aid could be lifted, that relatively large amounts of aid were able to get into the country, even al-Shabaab notwithstanding. And so I'm still confident that my argument explains those differences between Somalia and Ethiopia. One last point, though, is that there's the scope for backsliding, and Ethiopia, since I wrote the book, has experienced more exclusive political institutions, and so a dispute between the Tigrayans and the majority, or at least the ruling Oromo group, which is a far numerous, if not the majority of the country, maybe 29 to 30% of the population, that group, which has come to rule the country, even though the Tigrayans used to be the leaders before, that disputes between them led to a civil war between those groups, and when drought emerged, the Tigrayans were cut off from supplies of food assistance and experienced a famine again. So even though progress had been made in Ethiopia, it also experienced backsliding, which reminds us that achievements aren't forever and have to be sustained with constant vigilance. A last piece we touched on for the week had to do more specifically with Somalia's efforts to use environmental peacebuilding as an entry point for conflict resolution. And we read the interview I conducted with Chris Hodder, who is the UN's climate security advisor for Somalia, and he made a number of points about how they were trying to use climate cooperation on riverbank restoration, for example, as a means of both dealing with flood risk, but as an entry point for conflict-sensitive development programming. And this suggests a potential way forward that might be how countries experiencing both security risks and climate risk can address these concerns at the same time. as we think about what remedies would be required to address climate security risk on the continent of Africa, we have to think about the geographies of greatest concern and the problem sets of greatest concern. And so there are a number of countries in what we might describe as the shatter belt of countries with weak governance, extending from West Africa across the Sahel to Somalia, that may all face challenges of low state capacity, pretty extreme climatic conditions, and high dependence on agriculture. And there's scope for both farmer-herder violence and other forms of subnational conflict between actors related to contestation over resources. And so there may be a variety of ways out of this, both to identify the main climate risks, but also to think through what the remedies might be, which includes improved conflict resolution mechanisms, more support for formalizing patterns of nomadic migration, so that there's ways of enhancing both veterinary and livestock services, but also normalizing the pathways by which these herders go to specific geographies, and that can help establish expectations for farming communities. There may be other ways that these countries can enhance early warning systems and response mechanisms for dealing with disruptions to local agriculture. But there are a variety of other ways that these countries may need to buttress their capabilities to withstand severe climate risks. Some of that may have to do with income diversification away from agriculture, or less reliance on rain-fed agriculture and development of more forms of irrigation. There are a variety of other tools that are likely needed to be brought to bear to improve agricultural productivity. And these climate risks may also extend to other locations outside of that shatter belt. There may be other high-profile locations in Mozambique and Madagascar that experience more risks of cyclonic activity, and there may be specific remedies for them in terms of forecasting, early warning systems, and disaster risk reduction that are more specific to those particular hazards.